International Media TV, television that listens to you.
Hi, I'm Johnnie Burrell. Welcome to the program.
Our moderator this evening is probably the Bay Area's most beloved and accomplished journalist. In a career spanning half a century, she has reported many of the most explosive stories of the era, including the Berkeley student protests, the birth of the Black Panthers, the People's Temple cult that ended in mass suicides at Jonestown, the assassinations of San Francisco Mayor George Moscone and Supervisor Harvey Milk, the onset of the AIDS epidemic, and from Africa, the terrorist attacks that first put Osama bin Laden on the FBI's most wanted list. During her career, she soldiered in the trenches in the battle for racial equality and brought stories of Black Americans out of the shadows and into the light of day. And along the way, she encountered a cavalcade of cultural and historical icons: Malcolm X, Huey Newton, Muhammad Ali, Alex Haley, Fidel Castro, Dianne Feinstein, Condoleezza Rice, and so many more. She has won 8 local Emmys and a number of Lifetime Achievement Awards, including honors from the International Women's Media Foundation, the National Association of Black Journalists, and the Northern California chapter of the National Association of Television Arts and Sciences. She's profiled in the Newseum, the world's first interactive museum of news. Please join me in welcoming Belva Davis.
Thank you.
Our featured guest was president and CEO of the NAACP until the end of 2013. The youngest president in its history, he began his career at age 18 opening mail at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. He has been a leader of successful state and local movements to ban the death penalty, outlaw racial profiling, defend voting rights, secure marriage equality, and free multiple wrongfully incarcerated people. Under his leadership, the NAACP grew to be the largest civil rights organization online and on mobile, experienced its first multi-year membership growth in 20 years, and became the largest community-based nonpartisan voter registration operation in the country. A builder of robust coalitions, his leadership at the NAACP included bringing environmentalist organizations into the fight to protect voting rights and convincing well-known conservatives to join the NAACP in challenging mass incarceration. Prior to leading the NAACP, he spent 15 years serving as a journalist and community organizer. While at Mississippi's Jackson Advocate newspaper, his investigations were credited with exposing corruption at a state penitentiary and proving the innocence of a Black farmer who was being framed for arson. While at Amnesty International, he led successful efforts to outlaw prison rape, expose the increasing trend of children being sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, and draw attention to expanded racial profiling in the wake of the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks. He has been named to the 40 Under 40 list of both Forbes and Time magazines. He is #1 on the Root.com's 2013 list of Black leaders under 45. Please welcome Benjamin Jealous.
Well, good evening.
Well, good evening. The day is here.
Yes.
And since Charles has really read your resume quite well there, all we have to do is fill in pieces. You know, after a full day for me of trying to write an introduction, I was really happy to find out that Charles was going to do that, because I found it almost impossible. I mean, you started so young, as though you wanted to solve every problem in the world before you reached 21. But it is a pleasure to sit here and share this time with you. You know, I think we should start with explaining your ties to the Bay Area, because there are so many rumors. You know, we're ready to embrace you, of course. Who wouldn't in whatever community? But, you know, all those rumors about your moving to Oakland, not true. Huh?
Yeah, well, true and not true, right? There's a little bit of truth. I mean, as far as connections, I grew up in Monterey County, which is sort of like the provinces of San Francisco. And I'm a native of Northern California. My family's here in the front row, and I think my niece and brother-in-law are somewhere in the back, because she may sneak home to go to bed. And I'm here about 10 nights a month now in Oakland. So the people who do see me acting like I'm living in Oakland, because I am a third of the time. But I'm very much rooted where my family is, which is my children and my wife back in Washington, D.C. So I kind of do the opposite of congressmen. I fly out here to work, and I go back there to home. And I'm here because I'm working with Mitch Kapor and Frida Kapor Klein over at Kapor Capital. We invest in social impact tech startups that close gaps in access and opportunity and participation. For me, it's exciting. You know, I think like most people, I succeeded the first decade of my career because I was willing to try new things every week, every month, every day, if need be. And then I succeeded the second decade of my career because I found a few things I was better at the most, and I was willing to do them every day, over and over and over again. And I was writing my resignation letter to the NAACP up in Martha's Vineyard in the summer. I went for a walk with Mitch on the beach, and he said, "What are you going to do next?" And it's daunting, right, to have accomplished like the big thing on your bucket list, and you're just 40 years old. You know? And I said, "Mitch, you know, the only analogy I can think of is, well, I grew up in a town that was kind of half a military town. It was right between Fort Ord and Fort Hunter Liggett and the DLI, the Naval Postgraduate School, and the guys I knew who did one thing until they were 40 and then did something else for the rest of their life were retiring from the military. And they would typically go to graduate school. They would go to business school or law school or med school, and then you would meet them when they were 70, and you have no idea the first half of their career was as a soldier. And you would just think that they had been a doctor for the entire time. And so I said, "Mitch, I'm thinking about going to business school." And then he made me what I realized was probably like the most simple business school test, because if I answered this wrong, I did not deserve to go to business school. He said, "Well, you know, I guess you could do that. I mean, you could pay money to go to business school, or you could just recognize you've been a manager for like 20 years of complex organizations, and, well, you know, the rest of it I could teach you, and I'd pay you to learn." And I was like, "Well, okay, sure, let's do it." And the reason it was so easy, I mean, president of the NAACP, to kind of move into venture capital was who we fund. We fund Pigeonly. Pigeonly is founded by a black serial entrepreneur. It just so happens that his last gig, his last entrepreneurial venture, was a job that's not legal yet. He created sort of a private UPS for marijuana dealers in his city. It's legal now in Colorado. It'll be legal in a few other places soon. It's not quite legal in his state yet. Gets out of prison in his 30s, been there for 4 years. Highly frustrated how expensive it was to try to call home. He gave me $3 a minute in some places. $3 a minute. I mean, think how much money anybody has in their bank account. How long can you afford to talk to your family if it's $3 a minute? And these guys are making cents per day in prison. we at the NAACP have been working on the issue, fighting the FCC, and I'll wrap up quickly, but fighting the FCC for years and couldn't get anywhere. And he adapted Google Voice type technology, gave people a local phone number, dropped the cost 90%.
It's okay. It's okay.
So I was always taught by my mentors, people who are the same generation as the great Harry Bremont, who's with us tonight, and his wife Peggy Forbes, that you have to, the goal is to win, right? Like if you take on an issue, the goal is to win, and you have to deploy and be willing to use every means that works. For me, and I'll close this, again, my family's different. My grandmother's there, she's 97 years old. Raise your hand, man. Yeah, no, you're so beautiful. I can say you're 97 because no one would believe she's right here, she's 97. My grandmother's grandfather was born a slave. He died a state senator. He co-founded Virginia State University. My grandfather's great-grandfather was born a slave, purchased himself and his family out of freedom, started a bank, co-signed the Virginia Constitution, and was in the first class of blacks in the House of Delegates of Virginia. Those brothers did whatever they had to do to advance their community. We have to get back to that. There's too many of us who stay trapped in the nonprofit sector, who are only willing to try one thing. And the opportunity to try something else I just couldn't pass up, Belva. So yes, I do live in Oakland 10 days out of the month, and I live in DC the other 20.
Well, let's back you up a bit because you started early, so let's go back to the start. Somehow it doesn't seem to me that Pacific Grove grows a lot of controversial activists.
It's actually Carmel. Carmel grows the controversial. I'll tell you what, James Rucker of Color of Change and I are both from Carmel. So is David Drummond from Google. And James Rucker.
The silence that get you?
Yeah, right. Exactly. You're like, what? And James' mom was the president of the NAACP back home, and David's dad. So I used to tease them that the only reason I became president of the national is because my parents hadn't been president of the local, so I had to overcompensate. But James Rucker's a pretty strident, angry, activist, and there is something, I think, about that community. But the peninsula was a refuge, and it was a battleground. And those two things, force you to open up your eyes quickly. I mean, just to challenge, the community of folks I grew up in, there were sort of two communities. There was one community that was people who had moved there to raise their children, a little bit burned out from various movements, anti-war movement, civil rights movement, women's rights movement, Berkeley free speech movement, everything, right? And so the conversation was rich because you had all these smart people who really knew how to change the world, but were focused on going from changing the world all at once to trying to change it one community at a time, one child at a time, and gave you a lot of their time, and that was wonderful. And then you also had a very old, rich black community. We have First Baptist Church in Pacific Grove. It's like a 100-year-old black church. People, Pacific Grove? Mm-hmm. But we've had black folks there since right after the Civil War. And that gets into the battleground, because I was a local history buff when I was a child, and I was the youngest docent at the Natural History Museum when I was 9. And I was precocious, surprise. I had grown up in a family where we told stories all the time. My grandmother, the greatest gift she ever gave me was she told stories. My father told stories from his grandmother. I was born just 3 years before the bicentennial, and so a lot of my stories, at first, were from my father's side of the family. He descends from 8 Revolutionary War soldiers, and they have a long oral tradition in his family, and the stories were passed down. And children are narcissistic as they can be, right? I have 2 small children now. Really, the whole world centers around them, right? So, but it turns out that my father actually is related to for instance, he's a Willard, and the little drummer boy in the back of the Bicentennial corner, the boy who posed for that and the man who painted it were both Willards. So everything that I read about the Revolution I thought was about his family, right? 5 years old. And so I go to the librarian and I say, I've read all the books of my father's family. Where are the books of my mom's family? She knows who my mom is, right? I'm like one of like 3 black boys in the school. She says, well, we have the book on Harriet Tubman, and we have the book on George Washington Carver. And I said, look, I've read about the railroad lady and the peanut butter guy. Where are the books of my mom's family? Well, this librarian I met years later after being president of the NAACP, and she thanked me because she's now been celebrated and won awards for being an expert in diverse children's literature and programming libraries because of what was my first protest, apparently, when I was 5. Because where are the books of my mom's family, lady? Help me out here. But by the time I was 9 or 10, Monterey was the capital of the Spanish state of Alta California. Right? Monterey Jack cheese comes from there. It was a Mexican cheese. There are 2 Montereys in Mexico, one with 1 R, one with 2. We treated Chicanos like they crossed the border to come to Monterey. We never recognized that we crossed the border to take their freaking country, right? The fishing industry there was built by Sicilians and by Japanese. We treat the Japanese like they were tourists who got lost. We didn't talk about the internment camps. We didn't talk about the fact that those were the coastal Japanese and the inland farming Japanese owned half of the Salinas Valley before the internment. Chinese, we acted like they were on a day trip from San Francisco. They owned Pebble Beach before it was Pebble Beach. You go read in the Natural History Museum, I'm 10 years old, and they say, they show the map of the Chinese communities, and they say they all suspiciously burned down around 1910 or 12. Yeah. And then I remember going to this celebration we had called the Good Old Days. Right after the Feast of Lanterns. Okay, and the Feast of Lanterns, is based, I don't know, on they come from when there were Asian people who were living there in vibrant communities, right? But they had taken everybody basically but white people out of the celebration, and it was strange. And then we went to the Good Old Days. And there's a guy sitting there at the end of the Good Old Days, and he's painting gold on these little glass unicorns. I'm 10 years old. And I said, hey, mister, why are you putting gold on the unicorns at the end of the fair? And he said, oh, because next week there's a festival over in Seaside. If you paint gold on it, black folks will pay $5 more per unicorn. And I just went running right to my black mom, and I was just like, And so there's something actually, Monterey is paradise. It is gorgeous. It is wonderful. People there are hardworking. We produce incredible amounts of produce for the entire world. But it has been a contested space, a racially contested space for a very long time. When I was a kid, we read about Martin Luther King, but we watched Cesar Chavez on TV. And we didn't eat grapes when we weren't supposed to eat grapes. We didn't eat lettuce when we weren't supposed to eat lettuce. We didn't eat strawberries when we weren't supposed to eat strawberries. Yeah, it's paradise, but San Francisco's paradise too. And when you grow up in a place that is contested, when you grow up in a place where you watch your friends have to leave town because they can't afford the rent anymore, and you dig into the history like I did, expecting to find fairy tales, and you find wars, it affects your view. But I bounced back and forth then, I bounced back and forth then, and then I would go back to the East Coast, to my grandmother's house, and she would tell me stories that stretched back generations. And those two things, being grounded in the stories that came literally up through slavery and segregation, and growing up in a place where we had rich activist culture, if some kind of on permanent vacation from the movement, but still rich activist culture, and a rich history to discover, because we didn't know how to talk about it. It really shaped me. I think it shaped James. I think it shaped Dave in his own way too.
So what drove you to the East Coast for school?
Girls. There were 2 black girls in my high school. I dated both of them. And I walked down 125th Street when I was 18 years old or 17 years old, and I didn't want to come back. So that was a big part of it. Anybody who tells you, especially any young man who tells you why he did something when he was 17, it doesn't involve, isn't telling you the whole truth. I remember, Belva, I once interviewed a man who was a leader in the men's pro-feminist movement. I think my father is, or was in the 70s before they kind of upgraded their name, but he started admitting that men can be feminists too. And I said to him, I said, look, man, you're at Yale in 1970, and you could join the anti-war movement, you could join SDS, you could join, there are all sorts of stuff. You could be the Black Panthers, you could be, whatever, Black Panther, White Auxiliary. You could do anything you want to do, man. Why'd you join the pro-feminist movement? And he gave me all these crazy answers. And I just kept asking the same question. A good journalist, you ask the same question, you get the real answer? Kid you not. He said, brother, I just figured out women say yes to men who say no. I was 18 years old. So, his wife is a feminist historian. She has sworn me to never say his name when I tell that story. But the other part of it, I think there were honestly 2 other things going on with me. One was I was ambitious, and the Ivy League meant something. The other thing was that my father had been disowned. His family played a role in the founding of Harvard College. Bowdoin was really seen sort of as the family school. And I had a little bit of a chip on my shoulder. And so it was important to me to really achieve a certain level. And I remember I went to go interview at Bowdoin, family school. Jealous is a unique name, right? If you haven't heard it before, there's a reason. But it's known at Bowdoin amongst people to attract these things. It was at the time. 8 different people came into my interview to look at me because there's a jealous, multi-generation legacy family who's black, right? So, how black is he? Does he look at the other jealousies? And it was the one time I ever saw my white grandmother, who, bless her soul, stuck with us. My grandmother, my uncle stuck with us, but my father's grandfather, his big, and all of his, and his uncle and his cousins all disowned us, and we lost a lot of money as a result. And it was the one time I ever saw my grandmother humiliated. They said to me, they said, do you know Ann Jealous? I said, oh yeah, that's my mom. They said, no, Ann's a student here. Do you know Ann Jealous? I said, no. I said, who's her father? They said, her father's name. I said, who's her grandfather? I said, oh, that's my grandfather's brother. They said, you don't know her? I said, it's a long story. Well, I went out and they said, well, she's a student here. She's working at the camp right down the street. It was summer. I went to my grandmother and I said, they say I have a cousin here. She said, yeah, that's Bradford's granddaughter. I said, well, I'd like to meet her. She said, well, I'll have to call him to get permission. To meet my cousin, he's like a mile away. We had to drive back to Portland. So we drove back to Portland, we got permission. My grandmother sat there on the phone saying to my grandfather's brother, no, the boys are nothing like that, because his father had been given my first cousin was there, and his father had been given a tough time because he hadn't gone to a 4-year college. So she was at once basically defending me because of my race and what he perceived might be the problems with me because of my race. And my brother, and my first cousin, because he perceived what might be the problems with him because his father didn't achieve a certain level of education. I was furious. I met my cousin, she was nice. Years later, we're fighting a battle in New York City against the mayor who had given what his own chancellor of public schools called favored nation status to charter schools that educate 4% of the public school children, and had dissed the public schools, the traditionals that educate 96%. It turns out that her brother, this other guy named Bradford Jealous, very few men have the initial B Jealous, is a lawyer on the other side of the fight. And so I call him, I said, hey, cousin, I'd love to meet you. And he said, I'd love to meet you too, because I want my pants back. Now, I knew my father had lost his shirt as a result of being disowned and disinherited. But I didn't understand how this guy lost his pants. So I said, what do you mean you want your pants back? He said, well, it turns out we have the same dry cleaner. I said, well, I haven't lived in New York City for a long time. He said, well, that's not good news for my pants. I said, what do you mean? He says, well, he said, he must be the only dry cleaner in America who has 2 people on record as be jealous. And usually he remembers which one is me and where to bring my pants, but occasionally he takes them, I guess, to your old address. And I'm missing a few pair of pants. And I couldn't help but think when he said that, I was like, oh, it's kind of fair. My dad lost his shirt, you lost your pants.
Well, you progressed quite rapidly after getting over the girl thing at Columbia. Got yourself suspended there. Tell us about that period of your life. You were meeting a hard wall there.
Yeah, well, the first thing was I had to talk to the town butcher, and this is when it's helpful to grow up in a small town like Pacific Grove. There's one grocery store in the town that is sort of like a meeting place, a historic grocery store. It's called Grove Market. The family that owns it is actually one of the last descendants of the Native American tribes in the area. I played for their Little League baseball team. My parents had like in a small town, they had an account, so I could sign since I was a little kid for food. And I knew the people in the store. And my father had been giving me the blues because he knew that I had about 6 months until I had to pay my college loans. I had no strategy for doing that. I'd been thrown out of school. And so I walk into and the butcher, first thing he says to me is, he's like, Ben, I'm like, your dad's so proud of you. I'm like, he is? He says, oh yeah, he said you're all the time bragging, about his son who stood up and got kicked out of school. I was like, tell him to tell me that, would you? But the hard part was I was kicked out of school by Jack Greenberg. Jack was Thurgood Marshall's handpicked successor as head of the legal defense fund. He was the reason I went to Columbia College. The man who taught me how to argue, I had a very bad stutter as a child, and the man who got me to get over it, his name was Judge Bob Watts. And from the age of 5, my grandfather always had an informal bar in his house and in his beach house, and had a lot of pioneers in black law enforcement, like my grandfather was as a probation officer, who would frequent it, and Judge Watts was one of them. And he would always say, boy, argue with me. What are you angry about? What do you want to argue about? It's kind of entertaining when you have a 5-year-old with a bad stutter to do that. So eventually I got tired of not being able to get out and say all the things that were going through my mind. And so I got over my stutter, and he's the one who really in many ways taught me how to debate, and I was appointed head of debate and moderation in my high school debate team without even having to contest anybody because nobody wanted to argue with me. It was the way that Judge Watts had trained me. And Judge Watts sent me to Columbia. He said, you're going to go to Columbia because you're going to be a civil rights lawyer, and Jack Greenberg is the dean. And I said, who's Jack Greenberg? He said, oh boy. He said, he's Thurgood Marshall's handpicked successor. I said, yes, sir. And I went to Columbia. And I went into Jack's office one day. We had tangled the year before. The year before, he had very quietly signed on to a plan to end full need financial aid and need blind admissions at the university. And the memo that we got hold of on the student council, Eric Garcetti is the mayor of LA. We had run together on a slate for the city council, for the student council, and he and I got this memo, and the memo said, unfortunately, there would be a bleaching of the undergraduate population. He actually used the word bleach. Because they were going to end full need financial aid or need blind admissions. And as I said to Jack, I was like, Jack, do you use bleach to get out polka dots or dirt? So we ended up, long story short, holding a protest that got the attention of CNN. We locked several hundred teachers and faculty in the administrative building, and the president of the university and the dean. They said that they really needed to get home. We said, we understand that's how students feel like getting to college. They really need to get here. We want to acquaint you with the feeling of having to get somewhere. They had locked us out of the university senate meeting. The CNN came, it got on the front page of the New York Times, and a man named John Kluge, who in 1989 was the richest man in the world. He was the head of Metro Media. Had gone to Columbia on financial aid during the Depression. And he saw the story, and he called President Sovereign, the president of Columbia University. And he said, in effect, you remember that $50 million I gave you last week to build that really tall building? He said, I just got one question for you before we kind of finish that deal. How much would it cost to endow the financial aid program? I saw this protest on the front page of the newspaper. The student said, you're going to end full need financial aid or need blind admissions. How much would it cost? He said, $60 million. He said, I'll send you 10 more. Redirect the check. Here's the rub. Ivy Leagues take their clubs really seriously. Columbia University had lost its club because after the big blow up over Morningside Park, there was a big fight between Harlem and the university over one of the main parks in Harlem that Columbia wanted to basically turn into its gym, take over a big section of it. The graduates of the university were so offended they stopped giving donations, and Columbia had to sell its club. And its club, I believe to this day, is in the Williams Club. Do you know how much it hurts to be the oldest university in New York City, one of the largest real estate holders in the city, and your club is in the Williams Club? That $50 million was supposed to buy us a new club. It would be the tallest club. It's important when men run institutions. The tallest club in the city. And we had cost the president of the university sort of his crown jewel, which was to rebuild our club. And so the next year, Belva, there was a protest because they were going to build a biogenetic research facility of a type that the federal government says was too dangerous to be within 50 miles of a densely populated area in Washington Heights, the most densely populated section of New York City. 300 feet, I believe, from a daycare center and 300 yards from a public school. And this is a for-profit center that would in part specialize in the manipulation of viruses that if you just remove 2 filters would be in the community. They ultimately kicked out 4 students for that protest. All 4 of us were the leaders of the financial aid protest. It was the best thing that could possibly happen to my career. In addition to children being very narcissistic, baby boomers are a bit self-referential. And so the conversations would go, my phone was burning up, and they would say, look, you know, you're the first student to get kicked out of Columbia University since SDS. Since us. You must be incredible. And I said, no, really, all I know how to do is to get myself and other students kicked out of school. That's all you have to know how to do. You're the first one since us. You must be incredible. We're incredible. And so I took a job representing the Student Environmental Action Coalition, working in the sub-basement of the AFL-CIO, organizing people against NAFTA, because we were afraid that what has happened to our economy would happen. That unionized jobs for people with moderate to low educational levels would be eliminated by the millions. And communities would implode, and the gaps between the have and have-nots. And you know, I love that experience in part because it taught me, it was like my second major lesson in rhetoric. And I haven't been very brief tonight, I understand that. But it taught me, I was traveling with these union leaders, right? And many of them, they understood, you know, you have to speak like 2 grades below the average grade in the audience if you want to organize the whole group, right? And so this guy got up, classic building trades president, Alice Huffman's in the audience, she knows these type of guys, right? Good, tough organizer, make it crystal clear. We're talking about NAFTA, but he was referencing GATT. They were kind of used one and the same at the time. And he said, you know what GATT stands for? Guaranteed a toxic tomato. That's what GATT stands for. Well, who the heck wants that? And in that moment, I figured out that I wasn't meant to be a civil rights lawyer. Somewhere between having organized in Harlem having professionally, because that's where I went after the mailroom, having organized students, organizing now trade unionists and college students across the country, that it was actually organizers who could, in this period, make the future come faster. And I fell in love with organizing because of young people that I met across the country, people I've been kicked out of school with at Columbia, and because of old, just hard scrabbled union organizers like that guy. I would give a 7-minute speech, and he would just get up there and talk for 15 seconds, and half the room might remember one thing I said, and everybody would remember the one thing he said.
Well, tell us, though, enrich us all, telling us what is the magic of a person who says, I'm a community organizer? How do you get there?
The moment you know you're an organizer is when your brain has changed. Organizers, by habit, you're trained to always think from the goal backwards, right? To always have a goal and to know how to get to it. And there's a moment that happens when you just start seeing the world backwards, right? So somebody says something that they want to do, and you already have the 15 steps starting from the goal backwards that you have to. What people understand now, sort of in their, is that this is a moment when we need organizers. Because the battles at this moment, I keep pointing to the president of the California NAACP in the audience because she gets this, and this is how we ultimately became dear friends, is the battles of this moment are at the state level across this country. That is where the battle line is. Please don't train children who want to change the world to be lawyers, unless you're training them to be prosecutors. And Felton Henderson, if you ever have him, or Kamala Harris can explain why. But the bottom line is we do need lawyers who will have real power in our justice system, and it is prosecutors who have that now. But if you have a young person who really wants to change the world quickly and in big ways, train them to be an organizer and get them to believe in the power of states. Because that is where the right wing has dug in. We have a habit on the left of winning the wars and losing the peace. We won the Civil War. We let the country turn to Jim Crow. We won the Civil Rights Movement. We have now been subjected to a solid 50 years of increased power of states' rights and the weakening of the federal government. And Obama's in there, and all of us have had to just really smell the stench of where Washington is right now. Right? The Congress, yeah. You know, the last Congress, the do-nothing Congress that we all grew up studying in civics, they were called the do-nothing Congress because they passed less than 1,000 laws, 900 and change laws. The last Congress passed 220. 10% of those 220, they did less than a quarter of the do-nothing Congress, about a quarter. 10% of those 220 laws were for commemorative coins. What was happening in the states? They were shredding up voting rights. We were winning marriage equality coast to coast last year. Maine, Minnesota, Washington State, Maryland. We were winning battles to abolish the death penalty while other people were, shredding environmental protections. It is a violent seesaw in the states. But here's the beauty of it, and this is why organizers are so important. In our country, there are only two types of temporal power at the end of the day. We are in a democracy, and we are in the wealthiest democracy that's ever existed. There is organized money, and there is organized people. And at this moment, it is still true, because we haven't become explicitly an oligarchy yet, that organized people hold the trump card. But we have to be organized. Organized people can win every day, and certainly twice on Sunday, which is why they're trying to get rid of Sunday voting in so many states. But we have to be organized. And that's why organizers matter, and they're powerful. And let me just show you kind of how that plays out. Organized money had its way with voting rights in a number of states in 2011. Again, Liberals, progressives, we focus on the even years. We turn out people to the polls, and then the odd year comes when Alice really needs you in Sacramento, and we're all like on vacation waiting for the next even year, right? And we get our butts handed to us. And so 2010, and we also, as Democrats, tend to focus on presidentials, which is a whole other problem. 2010, 2008 happens, 2010 happens. We're all mourning 2010. When 2011 rolls in, they're shredding voting rights across the country. Florida passes some of the most restricted, not just voting laws, but voter registration laws in the country. In Florida, the new law said, come January 1, 2012, if you are running a voter registration drive and you have a voter registration form out of the office for more than 48 hours, you will pay $50 per form. And remember, we take out thousands to run a voter registration drive, it's like hundreds of thousands of dollars, or jail time, or both. Our people in Florida tend to be older. Activists at any point in American history tend to come from two generations. They have two things in common. They both believe themselves to have disposable time, and they're both eager to change the world. Those two generations are those around and below university age and those around and above retirement age. The NAACP, I have never apologized for the fact that we have so many retirees. They are an incredible army. And our folks show up. Martin Luther King Day weekend, 2012, the Tuesday after, turning in voters' registration forms by the thousands across the state. So do a number of other groups. The sheriffs are waiting for us. You see, the office was closed on Monday because of a federal holiday. It was closed on Sunday because it was Sunday, and those forms, well, they got them out. I think they had to get them out by noon or 5 o'clock on Saturday, depending on the county. So they've been out for more than 48 hours. There was, of course, no way for them to be out for less than 48 hours. We knew that. We took a risk. The sheriffs knew that. They were there to try to scare us, make sure we didn't do it again. But those retirees, most of them are from Florida. And even if they're not, every year we begin the Florida State Conference by remembering Harry and Harriet Moore, who 60 years ago trained many of those retirees when they were children, the way I was trained in Monterey County NAACP to do voter registration when I was a child. Harry and Harriet Moore were blown up the night of Christmas Day, 1951, for leading at that point, which was the largest black voter registration drive in the South. It was 120,000 voters. The Klan was then in the mode of what they called sneak attacks. They snuck into the crawl space under their bedroom, like cowards. They packed the crawl space with dynamite and they blew them up in their sleep. I've met the children of Harry and Harriet Moore, at least the daughter, one of the daughters. She was a teenager at the time. She's still traumatized to this day, as you would expect. But the young people who followed them were steeled in that moment. And when the sheriff said to, many other major groups, look, if you do this again, we're going to lock you up, or we're going to fine you so much money you'll be out of business forever. The other groups folded and they sued. But we're organizers, and we understand we only had until the end of September in Florida to turn the whole state around. If we shut down in January to sue, we wouldn't get open again until the summer. It turned out the lawsuit was successful, I think, in July. And at that point, it would be impossible to catch up. And so these retirees literally said, Sheriff, let me get this straight. If we do this again, we're looking at either a big fine or some short jail time. The sheriff said, give me some more forms. Because they remember Harry Moore, and they remember Harriet Moore. The NAACP in Florida in 2012 signed up 116,000 voters. It wasn't quite the 120 that Harry and Harriet Moore did in 1951, but it was darn close, and the closest we had come since. President Obama won by 70,000 votes. What that shows us is that in this moment, we can overcome the wave of voter suppression sweeping our country. The only way to do it is through massive voter registration. We all must become organizers, and we have to remember we are a young democracy. Black voting rights, people of color's voting rights, even if we're honest, poor white men's voting rights. Because John Adams, said that it would be mobocracy, not democracy, to let the privates in the Revolutionary Army vote. I mean, let's be clear. Everybody in America descends from somebody who's categorically denied the right to vote in the last 200 years. All of our voting rights are very fragile. The one thing we don't talk about with voter ID is all the poor white folks whose votes are being suppressed at the same time. The funny thing is, if you go back and you read your history about the poll tax and the literacy test, guess what? There were illiterate white folks. There were poor white folks who couldn't pay the poll tax. And you know what? People like Senator Glass in Virginia, who went on to become the U.S. Senator Glass, at the time he was State Senator Glass, of the Glass-Steagall Act, that Senator Glass, when he was a delegate to the 1901 Jim Crow Constitutional Convention of Virginia that undid the Reconstruction Constitution that my great-grandfather's grandfather had signed, my grandfather's great-grandfather signed, he spoke explicitly about the poor white people that they were going to disenfranchise and said it was okay because it was disproportionately less than all the black folks they were going to disenfranchise. As organizers, this is the part we have to really internalize. Our job isn't about disparities and percentages. Our job is about raw numbers. The fact that in this country there is almost an equal number of poor whites behind bars as there are poor black folks is something that we have to focus on, that we have to understand. Law is about percentages and algorithms. Organizing is about raw numbers and arithmetic. The fact that we have roughly 1 million black families and roughly 1 million poor white families that have men in prison in this country who typically feel trapped is something we have to focus on and talk about, and ultimately, because that is the Holy Grail. And I'll just, Belva. Last year, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act, the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. But we generally forgot, and I wrote something in USA Today about this September 1 last year, that it was the 350th anniversary of the rebellion in Gloucester County, Virginia, of indentured white servants and black slaves against a king who had said, and you can read this in Howard Zinn's People History, against a king who had said, in effect, and your status shall convey to your children. Our fight in America has always been about our children's future. We, the working people of America, have always been willing to endure a lot as long as we can believe that our children will be better off than us. Why is Gloucester so instructive for this reason? Well, it's for two reasons. One, we are now at a tipping point as far as the American dream. My generation, the 20, if you will, say 30 to 50-year-olds, we were told your generation might be the first to be worse off than your parents or grandparents. The generation right behind us, the kids are 10 to 30, they are the first generation that almost mathematically must be worse off than their parents or grandparents. And your status shall convey to your children. That's what we're in right now. But the other thing that's just as important is that, depending on what generation you're in, the collective memory about the history of race relations in America goes back either to Roots or Django, 12 Years a Slave. And either way, Porgy and Bess, either way, what we remember is basically like late 18th, early to mid 19th century slavery. And that's important in organizing and in politics. You know, if you ever razzed a political science professor like I would do when I hadn't done my homework and just wanted to change the conversation, I would say, so why do you guys call this science anyways? Right? It's kind of soft, kind of squishy for science. And one of my professors said, well, you know, Ben, it shares a couple, it's kind of, it's true, we just have theories, we don't have laws, but it shares a couple of things in common with physics. One is that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Obama, Tea Party. Tea Party, Obama. Again, the other is that something in motion, and race relations is always in motion, tends to return to its original state. we assume that the original state of race relations looks something like Roots or Django or 12 Years a Slave. Those are respectfully about 150 years after the revolt in Gloucester. The original state of race relations between working class white people and black people in America was, at that period, at the beginning of our colonies, one of shared struggle. You see it in Gloucester in 1663 with the revolt. You see it at Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, where they then respond by legislating differences between working class blacks and whites in ways that would keep them apart. One of the ways that you know something is not the original state is that you have to invest a lot to maintain it. It's not the original state. Right? You have to invest a lot to maintain racial separation. It can't be the original state. It stretches all the way through the Boston Massacre. And again, John Adams, in not one of his best rhetorical moments, defending the redcoats who had killed those men that day in Boston, described the mob as Negroes, mulattoes, and Jack Tars. Jack Tars were basically poor white sailors. That's who was here that day, fighting. We have to recognize that what the great lawyers area would remember wrote in the matter of color. A. Leon Higginbotham, great black jurist, said, any good lawyer before they step into court must know at least 300 years of legal history. Any good organizer, before they try to really change this country fundamentally, has to understand at least 300 years of American history.
Well, you know, I have so many questions here.
Sorry, Bill.
And you know, they want at least a few minutes out there. So I'm just going to give you a little something here. I want to know why the business of voter suppression has not seeped into the international discussions about the spread of democracy.
It started to. I took the NAACP, pushed, cajoled, organized delegation to Geneva. It was the first delegation that our staff had organized, our board had participated in a very long time, specifically on voting rights. The international community is outraged. Everybody watches CNN across the globe. They know what's happening here better than we know what's happening there. Ambassador Minty, who's probably the most influential African ambassador at the UN, he's the South African ambassador to the UN and the leader of the old OAU countries, you know, said that they would become our echo chamber on voting rights because the African countries were so outraged. We got the UN to condemn the US for, among other things, our ongoing suppression of the votes of formerly incarcerated people. See, if rights are restored to people when they return from prison, we still fundamentally treat, and if something is a right, well, we make it universal. In America, we still treat voting like a privilege. We do not register you automatically. I mean, think about it. If the draft board can find you wherever you go, your voter registration form could find you wherever you go. And yes, we restore to you, you know, your right to liberty, your right to work, all these other rights, your First Amendment rights when you come out of prison. But we don't give you back your right to vote in many places. Why does the NAACP have a grudge about this? Because it is the last pillar of Jim Crow era voter suppression that we still tolerate. The Senator Glass I was talking about, that senator who helped usher in Jim Crow in Virginia, when advocating for what is still Virginia's lifetime ban on convicted felons from ever voting again, And I've seen women who are active in the junior league talk about how humiliated they are because they made a mistake when they were young and they were convicted of maybe of a drug felony. And now they've gone on and they own businesses and they're pillars in the community, and somebody comes and says, Jill's running for office. Would you sign the petition? I can't sign the petition. Just please sign the petition. Do you not like Jill? No, I'm a felon. And having to out themselves again and again. Senator Glass said, because of this plan, talking about that, the Negro will be eliminated as a factor in our state's politics within 5 years. Because they had taken crimes associated with poverty and upped them to felonies as a way to control black men who were poor in the South. And now they were seeking to use that to kind of leapfrog into voter suppression and pushing black electeds like my grandmother's grandfather out of office by killing the vote. And we tolerate it in this country because we are America and we are the world's oldest democracy. We're the world's greatest democracy. We are the one that gave the world the idea of one person, one vote. And yet we are still functionally ambivalent about respecting voting as a right.
Well, you have...
But the rest of the world gets it, and they're pretty angry with us when you're at the UN, let me tell you. Because what they know, Belva, and this is why people like South African ambassador were so invested, is every time anything that's a ripple here in the fabric, a tear in the fabric, and former chair of Amnesty International in the audience, every time that we fought together, we worked together, for instance, against the U.S. Patriot Act, right? Mm-hmm. The U.S. Patriot Act has this definition of terrorism that says if you violate the law in a way that endangers human life in the pursuit of a political agenda, paraphrasing, but those are the three things, check, 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 then you are guilty terrorism and can be prosecuted under the U.S. Patriot Act. That's like what Martin Luther King did every week. Every time that you march into a street without a permit, have a sit-in, say blocking Broadway as I did as a student, you endanger human life in pursuit of a political agenda and you break the law. Immediately when we passed that law, Charles Taylor of Liberia, dictators in places that just gone through the Arab Spring, held up the law and said, finally, the United States recognizes what I've been telling you for 30 years. And we laugh, but people went to prison, people were executed, families were torn apart, movements were suppressed in countries throughout the world with greater vigor and self-righteousness by some of the worst dictators on the planet. Because we just passed the U.S. Patriot Act, which we thought wasn't such a bad thing. When we suppress voting rights of minorities in this country, people take note. In Asia, in Africa, in the Middle East, and they say, look, I told you. We're doing in Malaysia right now, is meeting with their opposition leader a couple of weeks ago. It becomes, these opposition leaders that you see in Asian countries are typically leaders of minority groups. When the US of A is allowed to get away with suppressing the voting rights disproportionately of its minority groups, it gives permission to some of the worst people you would never want to meet on the planet to keep doing what they've been doing. And so that's what, to me, was so important for us to go back to the UN. I mean, there are people who said, what can the UN do for you? Well, it's, among other things, they can shame our country at a moment when the leaders who are suppressing the vote, the leaders of our country who are suppressing voting rights need to be shamed. And in so doing, can remind the rest of the world, you should not follow the US's lead when it comes to voter suppression.
Okay, you have chosen two paths from here. I'm only doing this because the clock is ticking. I wanted to deal with each of them separately. So the news release I got yesterday talked about your association with the the Center for American Progress, nonprofit. Mm-hmm. About a week ago, I got another news release. Mm-hmm. It talked about your association, maybe it was more than a week ago.
Yeah, a couple months ago.
Yeah, with K-Port. So how are you, and what are you planning to do?
Sure. I'm focused on two things.
Okay, yeah, you had two things. One's for profit, one's not for profit. The problem hits everybody, the problems that you're talking about.
Yeah, no, look, my life is committed to continuing what the movement that my father's family was part of in 1776 and my mother's family was part of in undoing and helping to move our country beyond slavery, and my parents were part of when they met in Baltimore, where my mom had desegregated her high school. My father was one of the few white guys who went to jail desegregating the downtown. Of all, what all those things were about, which is about making sure our country continues on a path of ever-evolving democratic and economic inclusion. And in a democracy, the two things go hand in hand. The Koch brothers are not interested in voter suppression because they just like to suppress votes. They may not even be interested in voter suppression because they share their father's ideology. They swear they don't. Their father co-founded the John Birch Society. Well, Richard Nixon's dad was a Quaker. So it doesn't necessarily follow the apple and the tree are close together. The Koch brothers own a lot of companies. A lot of them degrade our environment. The demographics who are most likely to support environmental protection legislation are Latinos, number one, blacks, number two, and young people of all colors, number three. When you pass a voter ID bill, those are the top three groups whose votes you will suppress. They understand that their economic prosperity and their ability to control outcomes in our democracy are like this. So it is for us. The movement for economic inclusion and democratic inclusion have always had to move together. Not necessarily in lockstep, maybe one than the other, maybe it's more like jazz, less like classical music, but always together. And so I'm at Caper Capital because I believe Mitch Kapor, Frieda Kapor-Klein, the team there are onto something. That there are ways, there are places that we're stuck in Washington, like trying to bring down the cost of communication for inmates or the cost of remittances for families sending money back home to the Caribbean or to Central America. I'm waiting for Sandman to pull me off stage. But I've stayed involved in politics. Julian Bond and I are working together and seeing if we can actually get a PAC going, a big PAC, an aggressive PAC, and a PAC that will allow black folks to pay nationally in partisan ways that we need to be able to play. And Emily's list, if you will, for the South in particular. And those two passions of my life, economic inclusion, democratic inclusion, my unpaid, very honorific senior fellowship at CAP, which gives me a little bit of resources as far as staff support, will allow me to help contribute ideas. And so I'm an organizer, I'm a writer. I spent a good chunk of my 20s working in frontline journalism in Jackson, Mississippi, and the most frequently firebombed newspaper in the country. Belva, I'm sure they told you this when you were young. This is why my grandmother never wanted me to work for a black newspaper. She said, I know a lot of people who work for black newspapers. They never leave. The way that we say that, she was afraid that would be poor for the rest of my life, and overworked. And she knew I'd be doing great things, but man, all of her friends who work for the black press, it is relentless work. We say it in black media in a different way. We say once the ink is in your blood, it never comes out. CAP is my way to cope with the ink that's in my blood and keep on writing and talking.
Well, they talked about a railroad
Yeah.
from there to here. So we will let you take that responsibility and start building that railroad that's going to move us to whatever the next step is. I know also, and I heard the music, Charles, there is the next thing of coming up with messages that can be distributed in a way that those who could and should would be moved by them. We don't seem to have a system. I work for the Black Press.
Yeah.
I remember once when I had 2 jobs to do, and I went to my boss, Dr. Goodland, and I said, I got this person, they want to split a job with me. She says, great, you can bring her in. I said, well, how much was she paid? She said, well, of course, you'll get half of your salary. So,
I've had those conversations.
So I know what it's like to work for
Yeah.
Black Paper. Yeah. But nevertheless, we just haven't seemed to hit the right drum to communicate messages like yours. I don't know. I'd like to see a show of hands that everybody in here know about all of the battles that have been mentioned here.
No.
Hey, there are a few smart people here. Yeah. We're going to get your phone numbers so that you can call 10 neighbors.
No, look, I would say, what I would say, one of the things I'm proudest of the NAACP for accomplishing over the last 5 years is 5 years ago, we had about 185,000 online activists. I got corrected recently because I was only counting email. We had 175,000 on email, we had 5,000 on mobile, we had 5,000 on Facebook. Today, the NAACP is 1.4 million on email, 250,000 on Facebook, 423,000 on mobile, tens of thousands more on Twitter, and some other platforms that, I'm in my 40s, so I don't quite understand. That communication is critical. And let me just give you a quick illustration of how critical it is. When the Trayvon Martin verdict came down, the George Zimmerman verdict came down, Alice and I were in Orlando. We at the national office had been organizing and focused for weeks because Orlando is about 30 miles from Sanford. Sanford's a small town with a strong culture. We were not worried about Sanford burning. Orlando has a lot of hooligans. It's a busy place. It's a media center. It's a magnet for hooligans throughout the region. Talking organized white supremacists, black folks who, want to be part of chaos. Anybody, that would be it. We had been coordinating with the FBI and other folks who were focused on the tinderbox that was Florida at that moment. And we knew that the best way we could help was with our mobile network, which is approximately half the size just then that it is now, because it grew and I'll tell you how. So at that point, we had 675,000 on email, and we had 30,000. We had 30,000 on mobile. We went to 423,000 in a week. And this is how it happened. They gave me the first draft of the letter that we would write out. We had 3 options. Either George Zimmerman would be convicted, and we would write one letter, or he would be acquitted, we would write a different letter, or it'd be something in the middle. Convicted of this, acquitted of that, and the letter would be kind of. When I got to the letter, if he was acquitted, I said, this letter isn't angry enough. They said, what do you mean? I said, we're going to have maybe a half an hour before something starts burning, if that's where people are headed. We have to get this out right away, and we have to meet them where they are. If we do not sound like we are angry as we can be, they will dismiss this as a bunch of conciliatory, corporatized, middle class, out of touch, Negroes, that why am I on this list anyways? I said, but we are still the NAACP, so we will meet them exactly where they are, because honestly, that's where we will be too. And then we will point them where we all need to go, which is, this is America. We don't just have state courts, we have federal courts. We don't just have a criminal system, we have a civil system. George Zimmerman thinks this is the period, this is just the comma. So we did that. Our servers were then, we sent it out. Our servers were attacked, and what MoveOn will tell you is the most relentless denial of service attack that freezes all your service they have ever seen. Our servers were down for 22 hours. The typical denial of service attack is 30 minutes. We're like, well, what do we do? What do we do? What do we do? And our brilliant head of communications, a guy named Eric Wingirter, head of communications at the time, said, let's go to our mobile platform. He took that very short, very angry letter that we wrote, he turned it into a text. He texted it out to 30,000 people. The next day, our mobile list had 375,000 people. That verdict came out at 11 at night. That text went out at about 2 in the morning. But people across the country were losing sleep and were furious. When you bring down a racially charged verdict in a southern city at 11 o'clock on a Saturday night when half the young people are drunk, the judge should be charged with reckless endangerment of human life. That is good organizing, that is good communication, and that is the power of technology and mobile and the net. And when our servers went back up, all those people who for 24 hours have been pushing the button trying to respond to their email, clicked through, and our email list went from 675,000 to 1.4 million. This is America. There are two types of power. There is organized people and there is organized money. Organized money will give you the blues because they can buy every ad. They can buy up TV months in advance and block you off. But let us never forget the lesson of the revolution, the lessons of the suffrage movement, the lessons of the civil rights movement, or the lessons we have taught ourselves from the election of Barack Obama to turning the tide on voter suppression now, where we are now back to winning more fights to expand voting rights than we are losing against those who would suppress voting rights. That organized people can win every single time, but we must be organized. So please, if you don't belong to something, it can be the AAUW. I mean, if you don't belong to something, the American Association of University Women, it can be your fraternity, it can be, but if you don't belong to something, join something. And if you don't know what to join, know there is always a home for you in the NAACP. And
well, I'm going to just stop because there's a woman out here that I think deserves all of our appreciation. And you've mentioned her. Mm-hmm. And Alice Huffman, I'm going to ask you to come up to the stage, my personal hero here. Now, if you were out of whack and you did not know that it was Alice who organized the California legislature to pass the legislation that made our Bay Bridge, Willie L. Brown Jr. Bridge, the invitation to that function came from the NAACP, not the governor's office. For that, Alice, what do you call us? Are grateful citizens of the Bay Area. Thank you.
Thank you, Donna. Thank you so very much. Thank you.
You talk about leader with a big L that can take on Jerry Brown and win. She deserves a lot more than that plaque.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I should hold it.
Thank you.
Do it again.
Do it again. Okay.
I wasn't holding it.
Thank you. Thank you, Alice. Thank you. Well, look, I broke the rules. There was no director in the control room to turn off my mic, although the music started. Charles, do we have a few minutes for a couple of questions? Okay.
So first of all, thank you so much, Ben. This was a great return on the investment that Ellen and I made. We really, really enjoyed you coming here today.
Thank you
have
guys
to go
for
home.
support. Yeah.
We have to go home, and we're raising a young organizer, and he has a question for you.
Okay.
And he said, you mentioned the Koch brothers. The Koch brothers didn't give a Lifetime Achievement Award to Donald Sterling.
Sure.
But the chapter of NAACP in Los Angeles did.
Yeah.
And was about to give him a second one. I have one
They
lifetime.
also gave him a President's Award.
Yeah.
No,
So
they give him a third, they might have done that too.
exactly. Can you give us your reaction to
I can give you my reaction, right?
the efficacy of the organization, what it stands for, the rich history that you've exposed us to. And
my first reaction was a text. It was 3 letters. It began with W. If you don't know what that is, your son will explain it to you. Look, Alice, I think, made it very plain in USA Today when she said, this needs to be investigated, and it looks like money was a factor. People figured out that it was, and he's no longer there, and that's what a good organization does. What people should understand, it was very much the LA branch of the NAACP. Every branch is very autonomous, just like in any other large membership organization, and they decide who they honor, and they decide the criteria. I do believe that the national board, when it meets in a couple of weeks, will figure out how to make sure that a branch at least has better guidance. In other words, this can't happen again. That decision was an abuse of the trust and the faith of our members, and it should not have been tolerated, and it wasn't ultimately. But also, let me just talk for a second about how you balance these things, because other people will say, well, you just shouldn't take any corporate money, or you shouldn't, well, this person wasn't corporate money, it was an individual, right? When I was president of the Rosenberg Foundation here in San Francisco, we were the first funders, first nonprofit to write a check to support Dukes versus Walmart. This is ultimately 2 million women suing Walmart for gender discrimination. When I was a finalist for the NAACP, I kept being asked about this case. I kept saying, if I become president, the president approves the lawsuits, I'll approve the lawsuit against Walmart. We will join that case. I become president, I signed the case. Some members of the board were a little peeved, but we did it, right? It was the right thing. Walmart sends a representative to my office. Now, I had just gotten off the phone, I believe, with Target, who would let me know that they weren't going to support the NAACP ever again because we were supporting the Employee Free Choice Act. And I said, look, that's your decision. The woman said to me, I'll never forget this, she said, well, we're nice, but we're Minnesota nice, and you're supporting legislation to make it easier to unionize our country, to unionize our company, and we don't understand fighting with our friends. And I said, well, that's a difference. So we were founded in Harlem. I said, we're nice, but we're Harlem nice. We fight with our friends all the time. She never wrote a check to us ever again. People from Arkansas are different than people from Minnesota, apparently, right? They're fighters too. So the representative from Walmart walks into my office and says, we would like to have a relationship with the NAACP. And the person who walked in, I had known for 15 years, since I led a federation of black newspapers. And I said, we do have a relationship. She said, well, how would you characterize it? I said, we're suing you. I backed up and said, technically we're supporting the lawsuit against you, but same difference. I said, and we're supporting the Employee Free Choice Act, so we're also trying to unionize you. And she said, I get that. I wouldn't ask you to do anything different. You have to play your position, we have to play our position. She said, but we would like to have a relationship with you. She said, a more positive relationship. I said, well, I have this labor committee, and they will not support me, who would, frankly, many of them had raised me and had trained me and were, I said, and they won't tolerate us working with you on one issue while we're fighting you on another issue, unless that issue is arguably more difficult than the issue we're fighting you on. Well, now she thought she had me in a box, right? She had a 35-year-old male who suggested that there might be something worse than gender discrimination, right? So she says, well, what, young man, is more difficult than gender discrimination, right? And I'm like, all right, a feminist father, right? So I said, arguably discrimination against formerly incarcerated people. Because if mom gets paid less, the kids still eat. But if mom gets out from prison and she can't find a job, the kids don't have a mama, they're stuck in foster care. They have a mama, but they can't live with mama. She can't raise them. And she just started smiling. And I said, okay, why are you smiling? I thought I was gonna get you out of my office. I just came back and said, we're suing you, we're supporting legislation to unionize you, and the only way we want to work together, I'm prepared to support, is if you help me make it easier for ex-felons to work in your store. Why are you smiling? And she says, because there's an executive back at Walmart who would like nothing more than for us to become a champion for second chance employment. Walmart is now a champion for second chance employment. In cities across this country. That's what Alice has to do. That's what all of us have to do. It would have been very easy just to stand in my soapbox and yell at them and tell them about themselves and tell them to get out of here. And there would be a whole bunch of sisters and brothers who have jobs now who'd still be looking for jobs. What that did in that moment, we had a movement in this country called the Ban the Box movement still going on to change employment, right? Dorsey Nunn and some of my good friends out here, real leaders in it, schooled me in it when I was foundation president. Well, they had to go in prior to that moment and say to city councils, what we want you to do what Santa Cruz has done in Austin, Texas, and San Francisco, all these kind of like liberal university towns. Now they got to walk in and say, we just want you to do what Walmart's doing. The victory goes to the woman or the man with mud on their uniform. We have to be willing to be down in the mud because we're lifting folks up who are stuck in the mud. But that's the right way to do it. There is a wrong way to do it, which is expedient selling of your soul. That's unfortunately what some folks try to do to the LA branch of the NAACP, and I'm glad that our members in LA ultimately did what good members did, and they made sure that their leadership was held to a certain standard. I know Leon Jenkins. I know he has made a lot of mistakes in his life. He is like any other human being. He has some good, he has some bad. In this case, he needed to be punished for what he did, and I'm glad that they did that.
Okay, are we there?
Over here.
Okay.
Thank you so much for coming to the Bay Area. Being in technology and innovation, my question has to be about catalyzing capital. I work day in and day out with social innovators and entrepreneurs from within our community. Trying to get them capital, whether it be for a nonprofit or for social venture, is really hard. And it's even double hard for those of us who are trying to catalyze Black capital. So what are some of the things that you recommend, what's the leadership on being able to catalyze capital, both philanthropic and venture?
One is always to remember the basics, right? Like your grandmother may have told you something along the lines of, you gotta be twice as good to get half as much.
Yes.
That hasn't changed, right? The other is to be really clear about the nature of business, and especially, venture capital business, which is, don't bring us any small ideas, right? Really, when you talk to folks, when I talked to, for instance, a Black entrepreneur who's gone through Y Combinator, I said, what did you get out of this? Said they were relentless in pushing me to think to scale, right? If you look at what made the NAACP great in the first half, say, of the 20th century, it was that our leaders kept thinking, just going after the biggest thing they could go after. And that's great leadership of any color, and it's true in our community. The next is to, with that said, there should be no shame to your game, right? If you know that you're twice as good and you're thinking to scale, then you don't take no for an answer. If somebody you need to meet with. I remember meeting Robert Johnson, not the blues man, but the founder of Ebony and Jet, and Johnson, whatever, Mr. Johnson. Yes, not Bob Johnson, but Mr. Johnson. John Johnson. I'm sorry, man. It's getting late, and I'm still on the East Coast. John Johnson, John Johnson in Chicago, and I said to him, John, how'd you sell your first big ad account for Jet? And he said, I sold it. I think it was GE, but it was a big kind of name brand company. He said, I just knew that if I could get to the CEO, they would buy the ad account. But the secretary wouldn't let me get to the CEO. He said, so I just would call her and just talk real nice to her, just charm her, just make her feel bad for always saying no to me. And one day, when she just lingered a little too long on the phone, I said, I know the CEO lives in, I think he has family in Chicago, but the office is in New York. What train does he take? And then he bought a first-class ticket on that train. And he found him, and this guy had, understood, okay, I'm on this train from New York to Chicago. This man has a ticket for the whole ride. If I say yes to him, I get to go back to doing whatever it is I wanted to do. If I keep saying no, he's going to keep asking me all the way to Chicago. And John Johnson got the account.
My question is catalyzing black capital.
Right, well, so I'm working there.
Okay.
Yes, I'm working there. My big experience prior to this job with organizing black capital was to support Obama in 2008. We started with, some say, was the first super PAC in the country. Steve Phillips of San Francisco and Andy Wong and myself founded something called Vote Hope. We raised $10 million to invest in early primary states. 1.5 million of that came from black donors. It was some of the later money to come in. Yeah. And it really started moving when one black investor said that she would match every other black donor dollar for dollar. We have to understand that, folks in our community, money is often newer. They can remember just how hard it was for them to make it. It is precious, and they will often want to see validation before they invest. I mean, this is just real talk. But if you come twice as good so they respect that you actually listened to what your grandmother told you, you come thinking to scale. And like John Johnson, you have done whatever it took to convince some other validator from a different community to invest in you, you will often find that our folks are ready to go and willing to take the ride and make the risk. You also have to recognize that you are an organizer, that this will oftentimes be the first venture investment or one of a very small number that person has made. And if you're willing to do that, if you understand, if you will, both the value to you and your first venture and the next venture and to the broader community, I think great things can come. Being a black person born and raised in Northern California, something is wrong with you if you aren't impatient about how the disconnect between how long we've been here, how much of the identity of this region we have created, and how locked out we remain. And I know it's a lot to ask. I know that it's backbreaking, and in those moments, I think the only thing we can do is either remember the stories our grandmothers told us, or borrow somebody else's, and just remember that this is a wonderful privilege to work this hard with at least the possibility of so much reward.
Okay. There's one more question.
Hi, good evening, and I have enjoyed your talk this evening and the things you've said. I have a question for you. How hard do you think it is for us as black folk to see issues that are really important to us, have a president who happens to also be black, and then try not to criticize and don't criticize when he doesn't address the issues that are important to us? And even the grander issues that are important to the whole country, like the Trans-Pacific trade agreement that they're trying to ram through for this country that will totally decimate unions. There'll be nothing left if that gets through. How do we get to the point where we can start criticizing and thinking critically of what it is he's doing?
Trust me. I mean, there are... There is not a civil rights leader in this country who is not frustrated with the status quo, just like there's not a union leader in this country. But we also are paid to remember the basic lessons of civics, which is that Congress makes the law and the president signs the law and his administration enforces the law. And our Congress is at a standstill, what Al Gore has called our cold civil war in this country. I have, on behalf of the NAACP, even raised my voice to the president in the Oval Office on some issues to make sure he understood just how serious we were about what we would do if they didn't go the right way, and they went the right way. And the president took that because our president is an organizer and he understands politics too. And he knows that sometimes even your friends have to get a little loud and a little bit agitated so you understand exactly where they're coming from and can distinguish that issue from the 20 other issues that are important to them. But at the same time, we would be fools if we believe that the President of the United States makes laws. And what we need right now are laws to be made. It's the same reason why we would beat up so hard on Harry Reid and the leadership in the Senate, because they had a majority. That's right. They had a majority, but for the lack of a supermajority, we're not pushing laws through. Nancy Pelosi had done her job. Laws were on their desks. If it was no nuclear option, they just simply on the first day of the Senate had to set the rules back to what they were when Mr. Smith went to Washington. That a majority vote was a majority vote, and the majority won. And so, it is hard as we come to terms with this administration not to come to terms with our own sense of disappointment based on what we had hoped was possible in 2007 and 2008 and what we're dealing with now. But let's be clear, in 2007, maybe just before, 98 US senators had voted to reauthorize the Voting Rights Act. And now we are fighting for something that's a far cry from that. The Boehner is not providing the leadership that Boehner knows that he should be providing. He is of a different era when we actually got things done in Washington. But he is afraid of his own party. Harry Reid finally got a little bit of courage. But the frustrations that I've expressed to him in tones more strident than this, about them not exercising the power of a majority and acting like a minority when they have control of the US Senate if they want it. The situation is still, what did she said? Ariana Huffington once said, the Democrats suffer from congenital spinelessness. I mean, if Harry Reid was going to run the risk of being accused by the Republicans of exercising the nuclear option for just a little bit that he did in the Senate to change the rules, he may as well have gone all the way. We should pressure Obama to do everything that he can do. That's what Obama expects from us, and he has said as much to me on many occasions. But we should not let anybody get away with confusing our children or anybody else that the laws that are not being passed are the fault of the President of the United States. And this is a moment to teach our children, because our schools aren't, civics. And to say to them, this is what the Congress could do that it's not doing. And this is what the Senate could do that it's not doing. And this is what the President is prepared to do but can't do because leaders in his own party, not to mention the other party, aren't doing what we sent them there to do, which is to lead and to take risks on behalf of all of us and on behalf of our children, most importantly. That is the conversation we need to be having in this country. Yes, Obama could do more, absolutely, but what is happening in the Congress and the Senate remains a scandal.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Belva. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you. And thank you, Charles, for a few extra minutes.
And we hope that you'll come back again soon and often.
Thank you. Thank you, Belva.